So good morning, everyone. Yes, indeed, I did just walk out of the Bishop's Commission for Relations with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. I was sorry about that. I accepted this this task some months back, and I'm still not clear on the way the bishops function. I'm not sure the bishops are either, actually. But so today is the commission meeting. So. Indeed, as I was sitting there, we were talking about the Aboriginal liturgy. That was the point of reference. We had Sister Carmel Pilcher with us, and we were just working out some of the steps forward, and they are steps forward. They are definite steps forward, the way we see it at this time. Now, you've already done some work on this, I'm sure. I was unable to attend earlier on. But truth-telling, this idea of openly sharing historical truths, particularly after periods of conflict, to allow societies to move forward in an inclusive way, based on justice and based on human rights. So truth-telling that can involve activities at all levels, local, state, national. And you can do this in schools, you can do it in ceremonies, you can do it with public art. There are all sorts of creative ways in which to do truth-telling. And whilst it is very important nationally for any country, it's really effective if you can do it locally, because locally is when you actually involve relationships between people. Leading to, within the relationship, deeper respect and deeper understanding. And so in local communities, people can get to know one another, and people can get to know one another's realities. The more we can do that at local levels, the more chance we have to do it at national levels, so that it sort of comes from the ground up. So the First Peoples Assembly, they're in Victoria. This is from some of their material. Truth-telling is critical for developing a record and a shared understanding between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. And most effectively, truth-telling can change people's minds, and not only that, it can also change our behaviour. And so again, from that assembly in Victoria, they would say that truth-telling can do these things. Recognise injustices which have been hidden from the consciousness of a people. So at school, when I went to school, like a lot of you here today, we learned nothing, literally nothing, about the history of Aboriginal Australians. It was completely hidden from us. And that can lead to changing how history is viewed in a place, particularly in Australia. And it leads to the fact that people can be empowered to share their story if they are given spaces to do it. So I'm talking about this internationally, but also talking about it particularly and specifically in Australia. And can look back on what caused this injustice. What were some of the real causes of this? How did it unfold? Who was responsible? What harm has been caused? And then, how do we put structures in place to actually reconcile and repair the damage as much as possible? Now, I looked up truth and justice commissions in the world, and in the blue, you'll see all the ones I discovered. And it goes for 3 slides. But just to take a few, because they're interesting, we've already talked about this commission that was in Victoria. And interestingly, it talks about the violent dispossession and genocide of Aboriginal people during colonisation. In Chile, the commission was very particular in investigating deaths and disappearances under the rule of General Pinochet. And the report was then used effectively by the government in order to support people who were affected by that. So it was useful, not just information, it was useful. El Salvador, from the civil war there, subsequent to the civil war, again investigating murders and executions, including that, excuse me, and you might have this in your mind, of the murder of Oscar Romero and 6 Jesuit priests, the person who was their housekeeper and her daughter. I had to add the last 2 because it wasn't where I was reading, but I know it because they often get written out of history, those last 2. Mauritius, their commission was trying to cover a period of 370 years, very particular, very specific, and the impact of slavery during that time. Panama was particular under a former military regime which engaged in torture and other forms of cruel and inhuman treatment. So whilst this is awful as I go through it, I'm impressed by the fact that in various parts of the world, there are some people in some places who believe it's useful to work towards telling the truth. And some people are able to generate some interest and some hope in others, and then others, and then others, so that it eventually comes to the point of the government beginning a commission of some description. Rwanda, they had 2. They had one that was already going before that terrible war between the Tutsis and the Hutus. And so that had to stop. Subsequent to that war, a new one was formed, a National Unity and Reconciliation Commission to promote reconciliation after the genocide. Now, this takes energy, this takes creativity, and for a lot of these commissions, there are Christian people behind them. Because reconciliation for us is core business, one way or another, even when we've been part of the hurt. So still going down the blue line there. But a couple of others. Solomon Islands, closer to home, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to address the traumatic experiences of people during that 5-year ethnic conflict that they suffered. Let's go forward, Tim. It's better. And the one we're probably most familiar with in South Africa, when Nelson Mandela, during his time as leader, under the leadership of the former Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to study the effects of apartheid. And they called it very simply the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Sweden surprised me a bit, but they needed to do some work around their Indigenous people, the Sami, and the way they had been treated over time. So they needed then to also form a commission to tell the truth and to look for ways to repair relationships. And even closer to home, Timor-Leste. And there were 2 there. The first one in 2001, the Commission for Reception, Truth and Reconciliation, interesting term. And then the Indonesia Timor-Leste Commission of Truth and Friendship. So again, I put these to you partly because I believe it brings hope. It's awful to think these things happen around the world, but they do. But really, I think the one in South Africa, under the leadership of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, was like a domino effect in many parts of the world. So when they saw something modelled, something real, something that hurt but actually caused some good, different people in different parts of the world said, I think we need to do that. And they've garnered enough energy to be able to move it forward. Now, I'm sure there are other parts of the world where there have been people who've said that same thing, I think we need to do that, but have not then got the support, so it never got this far. But at least the blue tells us there are quite a lot of places that have attempted this. And I guess there will be more places that attempt it into the future. That would be our hope. And so Synodality, we've all heard a fair bit about this, but I thought I'd put just a few things up. This advisory panel, the body which gives the Pope a way of discussing the issues of the day and receiving feedback. In fact, as this particular author, Jessica Murdoch, says, it's nothing new. It's a way in which the different parts of the church can come together as the mystical body of Christ. So we can, in a sense, bring our theology to this, and so we should. But it is actually something that's quite real. We're looking at some of the, and I'm sure you've done this already, looking at some of the theory around it. Basically, this particular author says that synodality means collegiality. Now, how that gets interpreted by different people at different times. She goes on to say the popes have really always done this to a degree by asking at least their bishops, asking. Whether they act on what they heard is another thing, but asking. She also makes the point, as do a few of the different authors, that it is prone to misinterpretation. So we have all sorts of different groups that may want to be part of a synodal process. So I came back to Australia in Christmas 2021, and I was ordained a bishop in the February of last year. And so I've been out of the country for 8 years. I'd been in Italy principally working at an SVD house in about 40 k's southeast of Rome, where we have, since 1960, run renewal courses for our members. Now, there are about 6,000 SVDs, or Divine Word missionaries, in the world, and 1,500 of those were born in Indonesia, the biggest Muslim country in the world. And so they constitute probably the larger group of new missionaries who, for us, are moving around the world. So I spent a lot of time running courses. I was the director of courses with a lot of our members. They were renewal courses of 3 months. But that also then moved into working with various religious orders in retreat work, particularly. And then towards the end of my time, because I was doing so much work in the area of interculturality, I said to the Superior General, probably in 2019, because I was being asked, as a lot of SVDs and our sisters, Holy Spirit sisters, are asked in different parts of the world to talk about living and working together across cultures on mission. I was doing quite a lot of this, and I said to the Superior General, you appointed me as the director of courses, but I'm now more out of the courses than I'm in the courses. So if you want me to be director of courses, I think you need to make a choice. Do you want me to be the director of courses, or do you want me to work in interculturality? And he responded immediately, interculturality. He said, if we've got anything to give to the world, it's this. And so they quickly found someone else. It's a bit too quickly, actually. I was a bit sad. They quickly found somebody else to replace me as the director of courses, and I had begun to do more work full-time, really, in the area of culture and mission, interculturality specifically. Now, within all the different parts of our church in different parts of the world, there are various bodies that would have something to say in a synodal process. It can go from parish councils, all different groups that we have, parishes, in dioceses. It could even be prison chaplains talking to prisoners. There's all sorts of ways this can be undertaken and should be undertaken. And so a synod is basically intended to foster communion among bishops and with the Pope. That was what it was mainly for initially, but it's actually moved on from there. And that same author, Jessica Murdoch, reminds us that it's this distinctly human, not necessarily divine, but that's probably in our favour. We're human beings on a path to being divine. So Thomas Petri, Dominican, he had this, he wanted to say something about this sensus fide. So another concept using to advance this more collaborative approach. to both forming and speaking about or articulating what church teaching might be. But this too can be open to misunderstanding. Probably one of the more helpful sources I went to was this one, Synodality, a guide for the perplexed. And so this particular resource speaks of this synodality being an extension of the developments already born in Vatican II. It involves lay people in discussions so that this is a nice term, so that the future of the church can be walked while knowing the genuine needs of her people. So the future of the church can be walked, kind of like that. And this from Evangelii Gaudium, from Second Vatican Council. It is a mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn. The faithful people, the bishops, all listening to each other and all listening to the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth. And so some of the authors do make the good point that we've actually started on this journey some years back. This isn't brand new. And the Pope is actually relying on all the work done in Vatican II, or a lot of the work done in Vatican II, to still keep putting that into practice. And so that guide for the perplexed, again, another term I rather liked, it's a healing salve for a culture imbued with clericalism that our church has inherited. And the bit I like most about this is that it's a path for mission. And indeed, the theme of the Synod is communion, participation, and mission. So it's always stirring for a missionary to read this sort of stuff. So it's about changing our mentalities and trying to direct the institutional makeup of the church to be what? More mission-oriented. So it's all about mission. And we're all on mission. But on our way, there's a couple of things we need to be careful of. One of the main things we need to be careful of, I think, in this journey is stereotyping one another. Where we're from, who we are, who we hang out with, what our ethnicity is, what our generation is. So I'd like to play a few minutes of this particularly good Nigerian author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, because I believe she has something important to say in a very engaging way about stereotyping. So could we play that, please?
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination, they opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So, what the discovery of African writers did for me was this: it saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle class Nigerian family. My father was a professor, my mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left
Thanks, Mark.
Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19.
I just wanted to show that first section. This is well worth listening to. She is excellent. She's an excellent author, but she's also an excellent speaker. She has some really good things to say about stereotyping. And one of the things she says is the problem with stereotypes, it's not that they're not true. Sometimes they have some truth to them, but they're not the whole story. The stereotypes become the only story, and that's the part that's not true. So we can have fun with stereotypes sometimes when we're allowed. We have to ask permission. But they can be useful to a point, but they're not everything. And on our journey of synodality, I think we need to be careful of this. Let's turn it around the right way. We're good. So mission. So one of my colleagues, an SVD colleague, speaks of it as proclaiming, serving and witnessing to God's reign of salvation, love and justice. And then from Redemptoris Missio, a single but complex reality. A lot of the images I use are from evangelicals, not from Catholics. They do these images really well. And so when those first communities moved beyond the boundaries of Judaism, that's when the church understood itself as church. Only in understanding that God's mission resided in them did they come to this understanding. And the church realizes itself in mission. From Evangelii Gaudium, the church is missionary by its very nature. That's its deepest identity. And my colleague Stephen Bevans, also SVD, says not so much that the church has a mission, it's the mission has a church. I love the way he plays with that. So again, my colleagues Roger and Stephen speak of mission as dialogue, the norm and necessary manner for every form of Christian mission. And on mission, we need to be open to being evangelized by the very people that we are evangelising, that it's a mutual process. And from the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences, they have a lot of good things on their website. Speaking the dialogue aimed at converting the other to one's own religious faith and tradition is dishonest and unethical. It is not the way of harmony. So the best way we can be on mission is by modelling, by example. I might get somebody else. Could someone else read a few quotes to finish my voice for a minute? Does somebody else like to read some of this? It's just on the screen. Can we hear another voice?
Always prefer to be taught by all rather than, desiring to teach even the least of all. Each person dialogues with his or her identity. The church grows by attraction, not proselytizing. The church must discover the power of silence, confronted with the sorrows, doubts, and uncertainties of people she cannot pretend to give easy solutions. Silence not only gives us the God who is stillness, but just as importantly, teaches the public self of us way to speak. What to speak.
Just a few quotes around ways that we might think about mission. It's not always in what we say, not even always in what we do. It's more about who we are in the world. There are things we have to say and do as well, but being on mission is a really important concept. Another one from Pope Francis, the prophet. Speaking about mission then as prophecy, you might speak about it as dialogue, but also as prophecy. The prophet is one whose eye is opened, who hears and speaks the words of God. A person of three times: the promise of the past, the contemplation of the present, and the courage to point out the path toward the future. Prophecy, mission as prophecy. It can be joyful, it can be risky, and there is a need to be faithful, even to death. And we may know a couple of these examples: the monks of Tiberin and the school Sisters of Notre Dame. Dorothy Stang was killed in Brazil, and the fellows below died in Algeria. So mission, standing with the poor, standing for human life, standing for creation, for a community's integrity, is part of being missional church. We are people, as I said before, of reconciliation. There's various ways we can think about reconciliation, but this absolutely is mission. And this will often involve storytelling, and this has to be synodal. It has to be all of us working together. So various ways or reconciling activities. We can do it in the personal. We can do it in the cultural. We've been speaking about that. Through the political lens, and certainly in church. There's reconciliation to be undertaken. Process of reconciliation, actions of reconciliation, and rituals of reconciliation. And it needs to be from the heart. So it often doesn't work. But that doesn't stop us, particularly as Christians. We are impelled, absolutely impelled, into areas where we might either reconcile ourselves with others or be a guiding light of reconciliation for people, a litmus. Someone like Desmond Tutu, just looking at him, you think of reconciliation because of that Truth and Justice Commission. Evangelii Gaudium, the new evangelization, calls on every baptized person to be a peacemaker and a credible witness to a reconciled life. And someone might read this from Carolyn Wu, who was the Director of Catholic Relief Services in the world. Someone to read? Just have to read it. That's all you have to do. It's not hard.
Forgiveness is not just a nice word to us. We bet on it. We cultivate it. And we know it is very much in the human nature to strive for a peaceful existence. We know love only begets love, and that is true, even with one's own enemies. Love, not revenge, settle the score.
So there are lots of commentators out there, and I think we need to be careful about who we listen to. Now, a person like Carolyn Wu and the position she had as the Director of Catholic Relief Services in the world seems to me a reasonable person to listen to around something like reconciliation. Similarly, with something like The Voice, we need to be careful about who we're really listening to in some of the commentaries. And this one of the best texts on reconciled life. So could you please read this one? You put your hand up before.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. So from 2 Corinthians, and to be good Protestants, chapter 5, verses 17 to 20. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. We are, therefore, Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God.
And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. So it's all of us. That we would be on mission. That deeply includes this, reconciliation. We're impelled as Christians. And I found this, a little list around the spirituality of reconciliation. I like the list because it's very meaningful. I also like the list because it's short. Learn to listen. Develop our interior lives. Be present. Develop communities of reconciliation. And I'm thinking of some of those commissions and their beginnings, truth and justice commissions in the world. Develop ways of celebrating the sacrament, and as Scripture tells us, do not be afraid. Stay with it, persevere. So just to finish, I'd like to give a couple of examples in my life of being with people who I believe are on roads to reconciliation, where truth-telling, synodality, and being on mission is critical for them. And so one is this woman, Anne Jordan, presentation sister. There was a time when she was the coordinator of Cana Communities. This was written in 2013. I've taken it off an old website. It was much before that, back into the early 90s, when she began the ministry. Well, even further, 75, before she was part of it, there was a Dominican brother. I do remember that. I spent a year there in 1990 living there. So I asked the permission. I'd finished my studies in theology. I'd already been 2 years in Mexico, and I was waiting to be ordained. And I was waiting for a visa back to Mexico. I was missioned back to Mexico. But I had about 8 or 9 months, really, before I was going to get that visa. And during that time, I was ordained a priest. And so I lived with Anne and 3 young lay women in a house, a fairly large house, with 10 people, young people with very serious mental health issues and addictions in Redfern in Sydney. It's probably one of the most formative years. I just finished my initial formation, and whilst that was fine, this was probably the most formative thing that I ever did, was to live in that house with people like Anne, who has become a very close friend of mine. And she understands, or understood, and understands mission and reconciliation. She understands sometimes people need to lead. She understands that people need to act. And I suppose that ministry goes on till today. It's still going. Anne has stepped away from it. She's now stepped into leadership with her religious order. But one of the things that I suppose was clear to me then, and is even clearer to me now, is that ministry like this seem to get very little profile within our church. They exist, and they do all the good things we hope the church would do, but there's just not a lot of profile around it. More recently, I met this young man, he's 39, that's a lot younger than I am. He's young enough. So since going to Brisbane, this is me going to Brisbane. Robbie's always been in Brisbane. But Robbie walked from South Brisbane to Cherbourg, about 300 kilometres over Easter. And he did this, and this is his story. You can read this while we go. He's had his own level of conversion experience, and he speaks about it very clearly. He's rather charismatic and even evangelical. And like Anne, there's a bit of prophet in Robbie. And I quite like to try and rub shoulders with people I meet who have a bit of prophet in them. So he's got his own story, which you can read there, where he struggled as a young man, sitting on a floor in St Mary's Church, South Brisbane, after that pilgrimage, clearly experiencing the overwhelming presence of Jesus, and a sense that in his lifetime he will see a passionate, wholehearted church with a focus on the poor, and a poor church for the poor. So Robbie went out and rented a paint factory in South Brisbane and started a drop-in centre for street people. Now that's quite a ministry now, and the Emmanuel community in Brisbane have now become a part of that. So Robbie went on this walk, and he plotted and planned with my executive assistant Sharon as to when I'd have some spare time. And just so happens that through Easter, I'm a spare wheel, which I kind of like. I don't have a parish, and so communities and their parish priests are all preparing for Easter, and they need to undertake the whole Easter rituals. If a bishop comes along, he's supposed to stand in the middle of all of that, and I didn't have any intention of standing in the middle of anybody's work, so it was kind of handy. Unless someone got sick, which they did last year, I didn't actually have a gig. So in the end, I went walking with Robbie. I did 5 of the 7 days. We did 50 kilometres a day. So no one was more surprised than me that we actually did it. But twice a day, he was on Facebook as we were walking along, talking to the people back at the drop-in centre, talking to people in boarding houses, living with mental health, living with addictions. And each day we had a different intention. It's probably one of the best Via Crucis I've ever done. So one day it's for people with mental health, one day it's for people suffering addictions, and the next day it's about families who've lost people to the street or lost people with addictions, praying for those family members. It was very, very meaningful. And Robbie, in a most charismatic way, talking to these people on Facebook for 15 minutes twice a day. And me walking along with my head down thinking, I can't do that. I just can't do that. I can't do that. I can't do what he does. So a bit of a prophet in this young man, but probably one of the more important features of Robbie's life is this. And there you can see his wife, Catherine, and their 7 children. Now, that photograph was taken a few years back because I know that Charlie, the youngest, is now 4. But Robbie can't do that without Catherine, and Catherine can't do that without Robbie. So it was really meaningful for me, and that we get to 50 Ks, and then it was supposed to be 40 Ks, but Robbie, we'd get there and camp set up for us. We had a logistics team. And Robbie'd say, every day, he'd say to me, Bishop Tim, what do you reckon we do another 10? And everything in me saying, you are kidding. But outwardly I said, Robbie, if you want to do another 10, I'll do another 10 with you, because the idea was we'd do the 10, and then the logistics team picked us up, bring us back to camp. We'd camp the night, then at 4 o'clock the next morning, they'd drive us to that point, and we'd take it from there, which was all right. But there's a touch of prophet in this young bloke, and he's not afraid to talk about his faith and how it determines who he is in life. And that really teaches me something. So to rub shoulders with a guy like that on this walk was very meaningful for me. But all the way, a lot of people from Cherbourg, at 300 k's to the northeast of Brisbane, and in that town, it's principally our Aboriginal sisters and brothers. But since 2019, there have been at least 25 youth suicides. And that's some kids doing it at primary school, secondary school, and older. And so Robbie said, we need to be honouring the Cherbourg people who are coming into our drop-in centre, and we need to be honouring them by walking to their sacred place. And so that's what we did. And Robbie knew it in his heart. I didn't get it, I've got to say. I kept walking with him. I kept thinking, I'm not sure what this is about, but because I'm with Robbie, I'll do this. Until the Sunday morning, there was a mass in the centre. And I did go to that mass. The chaplain preached, but I went to that mass. And afterwards, a lot of the people who were there then left and went home for some level of Easter celebration, all the families. But a whole lot of people trooped in to do their washing, to have shower, to have coffee, to have companionship and fellowship. And we were closing about 1, so I was there till about 11:45, just helping clean up and cleaning down some tables, moving chairs, as you do. But I looked back in and I saw a group of about 12 people. Now, most of them were my Indigenous sisters and brothers. And there was a woman there with no teeth. There was a man there with a partial amputation. Another man with some disturbing scars on his face. And I looked back in, and it was as if Jesus was sitting right there saying, Tim, this is why you just walked to Cherbourg, because of this. Because I'm here. I'm right here. This is where I am. And it just all became clear for me then. So the prophet, in a sense, led me to that point of clarity. We need these prophets in our lives. And the last one I'll bring to you is Gary. So Gary's a veteran. He's now 70. I don't know how many of the wars in the world he's been to. There he is supporting returned veterans with this Veterans Care Association. In Brisbane Archdiocese, 25% of veterans live in that area, and large numbers of them are affected by PTSD and other challenges, and their families. And as he says, almost every week one young veteran commits suicide. So Robbie's galvanised to do something. Gary is galvanised to do something about that, and he takes a group to Timor. And I've had a fair bit to do with him over the year, and he says, when you get some big, buffy returned veterans, we're at an orphanage holding hands with kids and just dancing around in a circle. And then you're supposed to turn to the person next to you and say how much you love that person. And he said, watching these big, buffy blokes getting told by a 10-year-old girl, I really love you. And then watching tears stream down their faces. And he says it's one of the most healing things I've ever seen. And so Gary and Robbie, sadly, don't get much profile in the Archdiocese. So I'm trying to do a little bit towards that, to try and raise that profile, not for them, although that's good too, but for mission. So we can tell the truths that they know from their mission spaces. So people are truth-telling in their spaces, and they're trying to truth-tell to us, and we need to listen to that truth. And we all have those people in our lives. The reason I bring this to you, not because I'm special, although I am special because I have these people, but we all have these people. And so I just bring to you at the end here that same list. And with that, I'll complete my presentation. Thank you.